Hello, I'm Dr. Stephen Goldberg. I'm a psychoanalyst in San Francisco, California, and an associate editor of the Psychoanalytic Quarterly. What follows is my conversation with Dr. Joyce Slochower, who contributed her paper, Ending, Not Quite Ending, and Not Ending at All, to a special issue of the Psychoanalytic Quarterly on the topic of endings in psychoanalysis. This special issue will be published in the July issue of the quarterly. Dr. Slochower teaches and supervises at the NYU postdoctoral program, at the Stephen Mitchell Center, at the Psychoanalytic Institute of Northern California, among other academic affiliations. She's the author of many psychoanalytic papers and a number of psychoanalytic books, including Psychoanalytic Collisions, published in 2006, and Psychoanalysis and the Unspoken, just recently published this year. Dr. Slochower practices psychoanalysis in New York City, where she works with individuals, couples, and also supervisors and leads study groups. Our discussion follows. Hi, Joyce.
Hi there,
I am looking forward to our conversation.
as am I.
Good. So, we're going to be talking about your recent article. The title of the article is Ending, Not Quite Ending, and Not Ending at All. This is a paper that will be included in a special issue of the Psychoanalytic Quarterly, the July 2025 issue. And you've submitted an article which I think is wise, thoughtful, and challenging. And so I think there's a lot for us to talk about. And I thought that we might start with the title of your paper, because I think the title, those three entities, ending, not quite ending, and not ending at all, I think that they really structure a lot of the paper and bring up a lot of interesting ideas and questions. So let's take them up in sequence, and we should have time to be able to discuss all three of those. Let's start with ending.
Mhm.
And let me quote briefly from your paper, and then you can take off from there. Um, you you argue in your paper, I think very convincingly, that there is no one way of ending, that each ending is uniquely suited to the individuality of the patient, the analyst, and the clinical situation. You also write, nevertheless, I'm convinced that termination remains an ideal worth holding on to, but loosely, which I think really captures your idea about ending. But you also write, we haven't gone as far as we could in theorizing the place of termination in our work. It's time we explicitly query the value and absolute necessity of a formal termination process. When is it core to analytic change and when might it not be? So let's start with ending, and then we'll go on to not quite ending and not ending.
Okay. Um, so I guess where I would start in a way is where the paper starts, which is with the sea change in the psychoanalytic zeitgeist that we have all encountered over the last decade or so. One which has essentially loosened the paradigm into which I was in which I was trained, and I imagine you too, which
Yes,
was one where you end. You set a termination date and you end. And ordinarily, that's a process that takes some months. It could take a year. And when it is over, you and the patient say goodbye. Maybe you shake hands, maybe you don't. That's it. And then you say goodbye. And unless the patient comes back because of some kind of crisis, that's the end of the relationship.
that's what we were taught.
That is what we were taught. The irony, of course, is that we never did do it. It has always been an ideal and often an ideal that we held on to on paper, but, as many things in child rearing, do as I say, but not as I do. We didn't do it. We ended with some patients and others, particularly those in the field, we did not, for better and for worse. So that kind of takes us to the question, okay, so what do we gain and what do we lose when we end? And what do we gain and what do we lose when we don't entirely end?
Yeah, well, those are really important, interesting questions that I think you get into. Um, well, let's start with what you gain. Why do we want to hold on to the termination ideal, even if loosely? What do we gain by that, do you think?
I think that what we do gain, or what perhaps our patient gains, I don't know that we always gain, but our patients gain an opportunity to do something that in life often doesn't happen, which is a process within which one reflects on the nature and evolution of the relationship, on how one has changed, how the relationship has changed, and ultimately we give our patients an opportunity to say goodbye or to separate, if you like that language better, in a way that is full and rich and clean. Nobody got killed in a car crash. Nobody walked out on the other person, said, I'm done with you. I'm out of here. But rather, there is something perhaps a bit even scripted, but in a good way, about the notion that we can keep talking about ending with the goal of getting to a place where we can say goodbye fully, and with all the richness that then would allow for what used to be called internalization. I can carry you, if I'm the patient, I can carry you with me because I really know you and I am known by you, and we have talked that through. That doesn't happen in life very often.
Yeah, and isn't internalization a really key part of that? The idea that absent some kind of ending, that the patient doesn't have as full a chance to internalize not just us, the person, but the analytic process.
Yes.
So the ideal was that the analytic process would be internalized. There would be a capacity for self-reflection or self-analysis,
Mhm.
and the maybe concern that that wouldn't happen fully, absent um, an ending.
Yes. And add to that the idea, which has been around for a very long time, that this will give our patients an opportunity to mourn and work through loss. Not as traumatic loss, which is what most of us encounter at some point in our lives, but worked through thoughtful, reflective loss.
Right.
Under that, of course, is something that I think is quite problematic in psychoanalytic theory, which is the idea that the goal of development is separation.
Now that, for example, that's one area where I really appreciate where you're willing to go in your thinking.
Meaning,
Um, well, um, well, do you want to elaborate on that idea?
I think that lots of people need to be able to move towards separation because there has been something adhesive about the kinds of close relationships that they have had. And then there are all of those of us who actually never had the opportunity to form a deep and lasting attachment. Is separation a goal for patients like that? Or is the acquisition of a stable and reliable attachment that can be internalized across time really where it's at? And I think we haven't thought through the way that, if you like, the nature of the patient's attachment style or the amount of trauma, relational trauma that they experienced, might alter our understanding of what termination means for them and whether it's actually a goal that they be able to separate from us, or rather to hold on to the attachment. And I'm talking about that symbolically, but sometimes perhaps a little bit literally.
Yeah, I think that's a really important and interesting idea, and maybe gets at what you wrote about how what has not been really fully enough theorized about ending treatment, that there really has been this tilt toward the value of separation
Yep.
and
Like
autonomy.
Margaret Mahler, right
Yeah,
on through.
right. And you're really raising, at various points in your paper, the importance of being able to form and sustain a deep attachment. And this also is related to where we'll get eventually in talking about, what happens after ending, what about post-termination contact, and what may be helpful or not, that it can go either way.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
I would say that's true also about termination, in that I think there are patients for whom not terminating is a disaster. And I know people who have stayed in treatment for decades and decades, and the depth of that attachment has actually interfered with their capacity to find other relationships and involvements. There's nothing ideal about that. And then there are people on the other side of that, it's not really a binary, but on the other side of that continuum, whose early history was so dominated by loss that the loss of the analyst following a complete termination, no matter how worked through, represents a kind of secondary trauma.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a really important idea. Now, in your paper, and also in a number of the other papers in this special issue on endings, um, there's, let me think for a second. There's concern about resistance on the part of the analyst, that there are lots of reasons why we as analysts may be reluctant to end treatments,
Mhm.
um, for our own reasons.
Yes.
Oh, because of the loss to the analyst, that this may be particularly acute at the time of training, and then again at with aging.
Mhm.
And, as you say, and others, that this is also an important issue for us to monitor in ourselves.
Very much so. And don't leave out money. Because, I mean, somebody just said to me the other day, somebody who's in a supervisory group with me, this patient of mine who pays me my full fee and comes 4 times a week, I can't afford for them to leave, right? I mean,
Yeah,
that's real for some people. And you want to talk about the role of self-interest in this. There's all kinds of self-interest. There's emotional self-interest. I need to hold on to my patient because I feel enriched, I feel honored, I feel recognized, I feel loved. It could be anything almost, but that's my need as the analyst, not one that may necessarily reflect the best interest of the patient.
yeah, it can be a feeling not just of not being able to afford it financially, but not being able to afford it emotionally.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I just want to keep a little bit of reality in there
Yeah,
because it's in there. I hear it all the time. And on the other side, some people want to end with some patients prematurely because they're not being paid enough money, or because the treatment is so ungratifying, frustrating, boring, provocative, whatever, that the analyst is sort of sitting there thinking, when will this end?
yeah.
And I think we are all vulnerable to some iteration of one or the other of those. Question is how to own it and interrogate it rather than enact it.
Yeah, yeah, very well said. Yeah, yeah, okay. Well, this also brings up the question about, when do you bring up the possibility of ending? How do you think about, even though each ending is very individual, but how do you think about bringing it up when you're not hearing it from the patient or even in the patient's material?
Well, I would say I really try not to do that because that is a red flag suggesting that it is me who is wanting it. What I will sometimes do is say, how come we never talk about ending? So I might say something like that. But I cannot imagine ever saying, I kind of think you're getting ready to be done in the absence of any clinical data suggesting that. So what I would say we need to do is to really listen to the material at the manifest and the latent level. Like I had a patient once who showed no sign of being ready or wanting to leave at all, although she was getting better. And she has this dream. And she comes in with the dream. And the dream was that she and I were at some kind of something. And there was a party going on in the next room. And she hugged me and then she went into the next room. Okay. There it
Right,
was.
right,
Right. So hearing that symbolically opened the door to my saying, maybe you're getting ready to leave.
right.
That's very different from my saying, well, now I notice, you're better at work, your relationship is better. That feels to me kind of in the old-fashioned sense, sort of diagnostic in a psychiatric sense, not something that is emerging out of the relationship. So I can't imagine doing it unless there were an external reason like I'm moving or I'm sick or something else that makes it essential for me to raise the question of ending because I know I'm going to have to end. Right? That can happen too, of course.
Yeah, yeah. Well, maybe we'll come back to this a little bit later when we talk about not ending at all.
Hmm.
Um, okay. Um, yeah. Okay, well, let's move on to the next part of your title, not quite ending. Um, do you want to say what you mean by that and how you think?
Yeah, sure. I mean, more than one thing, but what I would begin with is the fact that when we are treating therapists and analysts, we don't quite end even when we terminate. We don't quite end because we see our patients, our ex-patients. We see them at meetings, at conferences. They may read our work, we may read their work. We bump into each other in all kinds of professional contexts. Similarly, um, I don't know, Bill McGillivray?
I don't
Okay,
know.
he lives, I can't remember where he lives, but it's someplace like Knoxville. I could be wrong about that, but it's a small town. He runs into his patients in the supermarket, right? They're not analysts, but there you are. You're going, it's Sunday, you're going to pick up milk, and there you bump into your ex-patient. Those things happen in small town settings, and sometimes they happen in the oddest ways ever.
And
Um,
sometimes Manhattan is a small town.
I have run into patients and ex-patients. I live on the Upper West Side. There's a movie theater I used to go to in the Lower East Side called the Angelica. It's about as far from my office and apartment as you could get. And there I am online, and who's right behind me? A patient. It happens. So we just don't theorize it and we don't talk about it. And there's a tendency to kind of pretend that it's just okay. I had a conversation with a fairly classical analyst friend of mine maybe a decade ago, in which I made some comment like that. And she said, but the patient terminated. What's the problem?
Yeah, right.
Like, there's a problem. The problem is that we're not thinking about what the problem is.
Yeah. And you, in your paper, you talk about how prior to ending, you make a point of talking to the patient to try to anticipate what might it be like? How might you feel?
Hmm.
You run into each other,
Right.
or when we do serve on a committee together.
Right. And should we?
Uh-huh.
What
Should,
kind, yeah,
yeah.
what kind of boundaries do we need to establish? And I mean, I think the answer is obviously it depends. but do we even think about it? What's it like for me as the analyst to sit on some kind of professional committee with an ex-patient?
Yeah.
What's it like for the ex-patient? One of the things that the field has really shifted on in the last, I don't know, 2 decades, I guess, is a recognition that the analyst subjectivity is always implicated. It's always in the room. That means it's not just our patient's feelings that may be evoked by these things, it's also ours.
Yeah. Now, what's your actual experience with that? I must say that my experience with that has generally been positive. And as you write, we only know from the surface. We don't really know from the depths.
Okay.
But my impression is that it's enjoyable, it's validating for the ex-patient, and also that in a way, it helps to kind of de-idealize and to come to a more realistic, human to human relationship with the analyst. That's been my experience, but how about you?
I mean, I think that that is often the case. I think that where I might disagree with you a bit is that the word enjoyable to me is sort of beige. Uh, like a walk in Central Park. It's enjoyable. It's hard for me to believe that for an ex-patient, it would be so beige to sit on a committee with an ex-analyst. I imagine that at least unconsciously, there has to be more charge to it than that, even if it's positive charge.
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree with that. And also in my experience, it only happens after we've discussed it. My, ex-patient and I, and it's something that we, have agreed would make sense.
Except that sometimes it can happen when you don't discuss it because you don't know, right? I was once we used to, at NYU postdoc, we used to take presenters out to dinner prior to colloquia. This is all pre-COVID. Um, and there I am at a dinner for this colleague. I don't even remember who it was. And who's at the table? My analyst. It's like, ooh, this is a little awkward, right? And I didn't know, and she didn't know. Nobody told anybody, and there we were. It's a lot of charge to that kind of thing.
Yeah, no doubt. Okay. Now, another aspect of this not quite ending is, you're talking about how we generally we do have contact with ex-analysans when they're in the field or when they're in our institutes, at least. What does that say, and how do you think about um, contacts, either planned or unplanned, with ex-analysans who are not in our institutes, who may not even be in the field?
I think it happens less often, but it doesn't never happen. I think in the paper, I think in this paper, I wrote about this, that I know somebody who it was into a kind of odd music, not the sort of music that most people are into, and so was his analyst. And so they bumped into each other at concerts. Things like that can happen, but by and large, I think it happens within the field. Although as I'm saying that, I'm also remembering showing up at a wedding and there was circle dancing, and who grabs my hand, not looking at me, but a patient, ex-patient. And we both did that because I had no idea that she would be there and vice versa. And there we were. So that kind of thing can happen, but the more elaborated kind of contact that you're talking about is mostly with people in the field, I think.
Okay, well, let's go on then to the third entity in your title, not ending at all.
Hmm.
And maybe you can say something about what you mean by that and what some of your thoughts are. I know that's something you've thought a lot about.
Yeah. So there's different ways of not ending at all. One way of not ending at all is to simply stay in the analytic relationship forever. And I actually write of a patient who said to me, I don't plan to leave. This is psychic maintenance. I can afford it. It's helping me. Why would I stop? Should I challenge that or should I let that be? I had a patient many, many, many years ago in the field who also seemed never ready to stop. And I had the idea that it was really bad for her to stay in treatment because it kind of kept her in an infantile position. And it kept her the one who didn't know, who wasn't wise, who was dependent. And we talked about that for a really long time, with my idea being, I want to help you get to a point where you are free to leave. You don't have to leave, but I want you to feel free to leave, and I don't think you're free to leave because you believe that it's my wisdom that keeps you going, and it's not. So we have that kind of staying, as in staying a patient forever. And sometimes, I'm sure you've heard about this sort of thing anecdotally, those treatment relationships aren't really treatment relationships anymore. The patient comes and pays, but the talk is not analytic talk. It's chat, it's sharing, it's whatever it is. But something is going on where the patient and I think often the analyst are holding on to the relationship in a way that is kind of subsumed under the notion that it's an analytic relationship, but it's not anymore. So there's that. And then there's the other kind of not ending at all, which is becoming close friends, colleagues, um, gym buddies. I mean, you name it, it has happened. And there, what we see is a transformation of the relationship outside of the analytic realm and into one that is personal and or social, often, I think, without sufficient attention to the implications of that. And when I say that, I really want to underscore that I do not mean to imply that I think it's always bad or wrong. I simply think it's not interrogated.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, one does hear cautionary tales about that, people who um, particularly if the contact is initiated by the analyst,
Yep.
particularly if it's premature, if it's too close to the actual ending of the treatment, that can be very difficult.
It can be really difficult. And even if it's not, it can be really difficult because the patient, I mean, I've had, I don't know why, but I have gotten so many people who have come to me following those kinds of treatments, treatments where the analyst became a friend, enacted a kind of dependency on the patient who then feels unable to extricate themselves
Yeah,
because both of loyalty and guilt and obligation and love.
right, right. So you were talking about, these very long analyses with no end in sight, where it ceases really to be analytic work. But what about, aren't there instances in which the analytic work does continue?
Yes.
That and in that situation, um, do we bring up ending? Would you bring up ending?
Mm.
Um, the treatment will end eventually, right? I mean, you talk about that.
Somebody's going to die,
It ends one way or another. But
right?
if work is continuing, if things continue to deepen and patient is continuing to, benefit from it, how do you think about ending in that context? And how and when would you bring it up if the patient doesn't?
Well, I have a colleague who is extremely old, as in over 100. And one of the things that they do, because they still work and they're cognitively just fine, but they talk to patients, you come to see me, I'm going to die, and sooner rather than later. Right. So that's one way of bringing it up. Let's talk about reality here. If we go on, one of us is going to get sick. I have made this joke more than once, but it's not really a joke. I'm going to come into the waiting room to get you, and our walkers are going to collide. Um, there is a reality to the aging process, and it's something that, I mean, Erwin Hoffman wrote about this a lot, and I think it was a terrific contribution to the field to talk about the way that psychoanalytic process creates an illusion of timelessness. And we need that illusion to do the work. Because otherwise, how can you just lie on a couch several times a week and talk about your childhood or whatever it is while life goes by? And yet, there is nothing timeless about psychoanalysis any more than there is about life.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, some people will say, I have many, many colleagues and friends who have gotten some kind of illness or other. Somebody gets a cancer. In the olden days, nobody told. It was a secret. I actually have a friend who was in analysis with an analyst who got lung cancer and worked until a week or two before she died, but never told the patients. So the patients had no opportunity to talk about it, no matter to make a conscious choice and mourn the loss of the analyst.
Yeah, I've heard
And
similar stories.
I'm sure you have. I don't think it happens much anymore. I think this is one of the ways in which the field has changed.
Yeah.
I don't know whether you knew Lou Aaron, but Lou got bladder cancer. It was quite an aggressive cancer, and I don't recall now how long between diagnosis and his really becoming unable to work. It's a couple of years. But he told his patients, he told his supervisees, he told the truth. And there are patients for whom that may not have been a good thing, but I would say overall, he gave people an opportunity to have their feelings in his presence and react. Historically, this would have been considered a massive violation of the analytic paradigm.
Um, yeah. Well, fortunately, things change.
Yes, they do. And I think incidentally, and I write about this a little bit in the paper, COVID is not unimportant in the way that this stuff changed. We all faced the proximal threat of death and endings in a way that I'm sure people felt during the Second World War and at other points like that. But this affected everybody. It kind of leveled the psychological playing field. And the notion that I could get COVID and die was not really a theoretical notion.
For sure.
Felt very real, as it did to patients. And so we were forced as dyads and as communities to address something that had remained theoretical.
Yeah.
Now it feels theoretical again. I was in an airport today sending off one of my grandkids, and I'm looking around the airport. There is not a mask in the airport.
Yeah. Right.
It's like it all just it vaporized.
For now, at least.
Oh, yeah, it's not that it's gone.
Yeah. 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 You do consider in your paper what you raise the question, can you really have a satisfactory ending meeting remotely with a patient?
Yeah. Can you do, how about, can you do satisfactory psychoanalytic work remotely?
Well, that's another question.
Yeah,
Yeah. But, since we're focusing on endings,
right.
what's your thinking about, the limitations of ending when the patient's not with you in person?
I think that we have, among the many things that we have failed to sufficiently interrogate, we have failed to really look at the limitations of this kind of screen-based work. I don't know whether we can really terminate in a full way when I have a two-dimensional vision of you and you of me, when we are not two bodies in the same room. A young psychologist named Leora Trube has written a lot about this, and her stuff is really good and important. And she points out that after the beginning of COVID, when we were all so relieved that we could see our patients at all, Zoom was a godsend. We stopped thinking about it and we stopped querying it. And so we're now acting, not, I'm overstating, but many of us are acting as if it is functionally equivalent, Zoom and in-person treatment. I don't know if I think that you can say goodbye on Zoom. I mean, you may not have a choice, but as a full ending, to say the obvious, you and I are not making eye contact. We create the illusion that we're making eye contact. And if I do that, I think it feels to you more like I'm making eye contact than if I look at your face because of where the camera is positioned. But either way, we're not actually making eye contact. And that has all kinds of complications and consequences for the depth of the emotional connection that we can make. So how can we terminate if we're not even two bodies in the same room looking at each other?
Yeah, good point. So would you agree, as I'm sure you do, but we could talk about this a bit, that even at our best and at our most thoughtful and analytic, we often make mistakes around decisions around ending.
Mhm.
That um, it looks like it's timely, it's in the patient's material, and so on. It's well discussed. Things look, very promising in terms of not just ending, but making use of that ending in the ways that we were talking about earlier with the internalization.
Mhm.
And then before long, the patient returns and it becomes clear that, that it was premature. We can't know these things, but, um, it seems like we have to be modest in what we can actually predict and know about the timeliness of ending.
I mean, another way of putting that might be there is no such thing as a complete analysis. So we go as far as we go, and it may or may not be far enough. If a patient comes back to us, does that mean that the termination was incomplete or premature? Sometimes. Sometimes not. Sometimes, I worked with a guy, he really did well. And then that the crash, when was the crash? I can't remember now. The stock market crash.
Yeah.
Whenever that was, his business went belly up and he crashed and came back because his entire life was demolished when he lost his sense of agency and power at work. Right. That's existential reality breaking in on analytic process, and that can happen to anybody. So I would not necessarily say that because somebody comes back, the treatment was inadequate or prematurely ended or anything like that. It could, but again, going back to the old tradition of saying goodbye and never ever having contact again, I would say, well, maybe. But maybe having that contact is coming out of something that is in the patient's best interest.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember an experience with a friend and colleague. Um, it was about a year after he had ended his analysis, and we were speaking, and I just asked him how he was, and he said, "Really good. I just finished my analysis." This is a year later.
Uh-huh.
And it seemed very wise in a way, that there's a whole post-ending phase and
Yes.
something we can't predict,
We
but
can't
it may
predict.
be very, very important.
Hugely important. And then we could ask, do we truncate that if we interfere with somebody terminating by allowing the treatment to go on and on? Or for some people, might the treatment need to go on and on because there was so much early trauma and loss that they can't do what your friend could do, which was to carry his analysis and I assume his analyst inside him.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you've mentioned several times various things that we tend not to query. That was your word.
Mhm.
And I just want to end, or at least move toward our ending of this conversation, just to say that I think it's that emphasis that you have on querying just those things that we don't, and sometimes we don't want to.
Mhm.
But that I think, as much as anything else in your paper, I think that spirit of, that querying every aspect of this that I really respect and admire. And I think readers will feel the same way in reading your paper.
Well, thank you. It's kind of like the elephants in the room. Let's name them.
Yeah. But we don't all do that.
No,
Certainly not
most
all
of
the
us
time.
don't. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I would add, there's something that I don't talk about in this paper at all. I've written about it elsewhere, but that is the evolution of an analytic relationship post-termination into a sexual relationship. I just, that would have been a whole other paper, so I left it out. But that's something else that happens often enough.
Well, let before we end, we have a little bit of time. Do you want to say more about that? I know you've written a separate paper entitled Sequels, where
But that wasn't
no,
sexual.
that wasn't sexual. That was just a friendship. Okay, but go ahead. Let's hear what you're thinking.
I mean, my thinking about this is that psychoanalytic relationships are so complicated to begin with that bringing sex in just turns it into a hornet's nest of a mess. And I know people who have married their analysts. I know analysts who have had all kinds of dual relationships with patients. I know analysts who analyze the patient and then have sex with the patient, like, in the same 2-hour period, things like that. I mean, essentially, I think it's a disaster. So I would put nothing in there on the side of the positive, only want to say that we have to name it. We have to acknowledge that it happens. There is no institute in which it has not happened, to my knowledge. And I've talked about that in a million different places, and I always get nods. So, what's going on that analysts do that? And how can we talk about it in a way that doesn't make us seem like the moral police, but get people thinking about what is being enacted when they move from analysis to sex?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I'm glad we got to that. That's also very important. Is there anything else that we haven't covered that you want to bring up in relation to your paper?
Mm, only COVID, which I did mention a bit,
Yeah.
because I really think that it was a piece of what happened. That we had, on the one side, theory changed when the relational and interpersonal perspectives sort of became widely accepted and humanized the analytic relationship and made room for the analyst to be a person. But with that came the underbelly of all that, which is a loosening of the question, how can I get my needs met in this relationship? So that was one big thrust that I think complicated the termination process. The other was, I think, I'm not sure, but I think COVID really shifted the asymmetry in the relationship in a way that pulled many of us to feel like we and our patients are like subjects. And I would add, and this is not in my paper, but I don't know what's going on. I mean, you're in San Francisco, right?
Yes.
So it has to be the same as in New York. I have no patients who are not utterly appalled at what's going on politically in this country. And there is no way that I can sit there straight-faced and analyze it. I mean, we agree. I have a patient who is trying to get involved legally in fighting Trump. And I said, I so admire that. It's a very non-analytic statement. If they terminate. They're terminating with me from a perspective that has much more of a collegial element than I think it did in earlier times.
Yeah,
Because we are all, the playing field has been leveled.
I think so too, and there's no going back.
I don't think there is. When I think about the rules that we used to impose, if you cancel, you can give me 3 weeks notice, but your pay. That's how I was trained. That's what I did. I can't do that anymore. I just can't do it.
I don't either.
Yeah.
Well, Joyce, thank you. I think it's
Fun.
a rich discussion, and thank you for your paper.
My pleasure.
Okay.
And I'm really glad that this issue is coming out because it really is something that has to be talked about.
I think so. And your paper is among a number of papers that I think will raise a lot of interesting questions.
That will be great to read. I look forward to seeing the whole issue.
Okay. Thanks very much.
My pleasure. Thank you, Steve.